Welcome to the webinar, Mining and the Genocide Ecocide Nexus. My name is Sophia Hagalani-Albab, and I am a doctoral student at the University of Helsinki and a member of the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives initiative called EXALT. I'll be sharing some of the logistics of the webinar, and I am pleased to be acting as your facilitator today. As mentioned, this webinar or the seminar will be recorded. During the presentations, please use the chat to write down any questions or comments that you might have for the speakers. Before our time together today is over, we will have time for a question and answer session with the audience. And I will give further guidance on how that aspect of the webinar will be facilitated as we get closer to it. Our agenda today. Over the next 2 hours, we will be hearing some great talks from our keynote speaker and our discussants, including a facilitated dialogue. And then at the end of the event, we will have that open question and answer session. So over the next 2 hours, we will be focusing on how capitalism and industrialism have been systematically consuming the planet and working to assimilate and homogenize human and non-humans into their networks of production and consumption. This has had exterminating consequences, taking a serious toll on human and biological diversity, triggering widespread socio-ecological crises, climate catastrophe, and is making a 6th extinction an imminent possibility. The harsh realities of technological capitalism raise the conceptual relevance of genocide and ecocide in this research. But yet, why do researchers systematically underestimate the progressive and slow cumulative impacts of capitalism, industrialization, and technological development? This webinar will focus on bridging these gaps by exploring colonial critical genocide studies in relation to political ecology, anthropology, and human geography. Discussing critical genocide studies in relationship to fieldwork, this webinar will unpack the particular relevance of the genocide ecocide nexus to political ecology, but also the difficult dilemmas faced when substantiating the claims of research participants on the ground. As you can see from the agenda, this webinar begins with the keynote speech by Dr. Alexander Dunlap, who will give a presentation based around 2 open access articles, which we are linking down in the chat. So if you want to get access to those articles, we are putting the link in the chat. After Dr. Dunlap's contribution, laying out a terrain of terms, reasons, and concerns, we have 3 fantastic discussants. After that, the floor will then be open for a facilitated Q&A with the attendees. As mentioned earlier, I said that I was from the EXALT initiative. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives initiative, EXALT. We were founded in 2019 and launched in 2020 at the University of Helsinki. EXALT is a research initiative which is focused on political, ecological, and political economic aspects of global extractivism and the associated socio-economically destructive forms of natural resource extraction around the globe and the transformative alternatives to these extractions. EXALT offers critical social scientific analyses of extractivism as one of the most important or one of the most problematic issues of our time and of key importance for managing pressing global problems. If you are interested to learn more about the EXALT initiative, we will put the link to our website in the chat. Without further ado, I will briefly introduce our keynote speaker, Alexander Dunlap, and then yield the floor. Alexander Dunlap is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Development and the Environment at the University of Oslo. He holds a PhD in social anthropology from Vrije University in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. His PhD thesis examined the socio-ecological impact of wind energy development on Zapotec and Aicut peoples in the Isthmus of
Tehuantepec.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Really appreciate that, which is in the region of Oaxaca. His work has critically examined police-military transformations and market-based conservation, wind energy development, and extractive projects, more generally also looking at coal mining in Germany and copper mining in Peru. His current research investigates the formation of transnational supergrids and the connections between conventional and renewable energy extraction operations. So with that, I will now stop my share, and Alexander, the floor is yours.
All right, let's get into it. We don't have much time and we got a lot of heavy stuff to do. Let's see if I can get the... So yeah, no, thanks so much for especially all the discussions coming out. I really appreciate it. The EXALT network is amazing. I'm deeply dissatisfied with all these associations where we have to pay a couple hundred, which I guess still seems like money for me, a lot of money to me, to associate and to congregate. So I really appreciate a lot of the voluntary work done by EXALT and other conferences like Pollen. But so thanks so much. And I'm super happy to see friends and the great people to speak about some of this stuff today, because I've wanted to have this conversation for a long time and haven't really been able to have it. There was one conference that a special issue came out of that kind of began it, but hopefully we can get into it a bit more. So yeah, with structure, here's kind of where we're going to go and get into. There's kind of a point and a structure, but it's best that we I talk about how it started. So yeah, ultimately this began in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec region when I began my PhD field work, where Martin will be able to speak more about some of this, and was even there and is still there doing great work in the Universidad de Comunalidad. But ultimately, when I came into this region, of course, I was like, okay, wind turbines aren't so good. It's going to be, you know, some kind of environmental justice issue in terms of the distributions of the costs and the benefits of wind energy development. You know, I knew there were some problems. I read about things, but to my surprise, very quickly when I went in there, the term genocide and ecocide and ethnocide were being used. And I think really quickly, I was actually speaking with someone from the outside who was in there, who'd been there for a year and a half or more in solidarity and fighting with the Zapotecs and Akuts, who were more or less picked up, began resisting militantly the kind of the invasion of politicians, and also, and mostly because of their collaboration with the wind companies to sell them out in their land. And so here's kind of where this conversation kind of hit me on the head unexpectedly, where I realized that things were going to go a lot deeper than I imagined. And so I was trying to play devil advocate with this person, being like, hey, but you're not from this town. Like, how can you, like, why are you here kind of pushing for kind of militant resistance against these things? And here's what they said. And they told me about a story they had with someone who was fighting on the armed side in favor of the wind turbines and trying to push them in. And it said, but what is happening here is happening to a lot of places in this country and in this state of Mexico, and it needs to be halted, because I think the progress of modernity is a threat to life itself. It is going to kill us. It is a hegemonic power that does not respect any other way of life, and it has to be stopped. The Industrial Revolution in Europe destroyed a shit ton of things there. It wiped out just about everything, a bunch of species, trees, and many other ways of living. So yeah, it has to be stopped, and it does well fucking concern me. But I think the power to halt the renewable energy wind projects is important, because yes, I believe these projects are part of a strategy of ethnocide. I do think they want to kill them, the Zapotec and Akut people in the area. And so for me, I was just kind of like, okay, I was like, wow, like coming in hot. And so this began my thinking of like, I kind of ignored this first one, but it began my thinking later on, because it kept coming up in interviews with people. This is ecocide, this is ethnocide, this is genocide. And I kind of put me, after my fieldwork, it put me in this situation like, shit, like how do I honor what I'm learning about in this area? And so, for example, one of the key things, and we're going to go through kind of the basics of like where the term genocide comes from and all this, and the great work that's been done in kind of critical genocide studies. But what we are seeing with the wind turbines development, and Martin will be able to speak much more about this, but here's a bit of a sample, is the idea to threaten and to eliminate subsistence. So when you intervene into the environment to begin building these projects, you then are potentially destroying the environment and the ability to subsist. And so speaking a bit generally about the region, because there's different dynamics in every town, the first one is that when they started doing test wind turbines in Guijiro or Álvaro Obregón, where Martin and I lived for my doctoral fieldwork, and Martin lived for, it still lives, and, or at least I don't actually know, but has spent a lot of time in this region, is that marine life, they started drilling test turbines in the Bar de Santa Teresa, which is a very sensitive ecological area. It's this big sandbar. It took 10,000 years to form, but ultimately people began witnessing the fish going crazy and dying in mass. And it was a bit of a slow dying. And in other regions, when they were building wind turbines, because of the concrete foundations, they was affecting the water table, which we'll talk about more. And well, I guess specifically, it was either drying crops in the hot season, and then it was flooding crops. And then when they built the roads, which was destroying habitat and things like this, it was raising the roads a certain amount of time. So when it flooded, the people who refused to sell to the wind companies and who really cherished their agrarian culture and farming and the relationship with the land, they ultimately had pools built around them to kind of drown them out of there. And so this is kind of talked about in the last conclusion of the book, Renewing Destruction, if you want to read more about it. And this goes to the kind of the general disruption of the hydrological table. And so when you put, so for example, right now in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec region, there's over 2,000 wind turbines. And so this is actually preventing the draining of fresh water into the Laguna Superior, which is, again, a very sensitive ecological area that's kind of negotiating the Pacific Ocean and the different water runoffs. And this affects the fishing, which again is another issue that leads to the impacts of salinity in the sea and affects how people are living and subsisting in the area. And again, so when you build these things with the roads, you're cutting habitat, you're doing above ground power lines, below ground, depending on the project. If there are roads, you have to compact the soil and widen them. I speak about these a lot, but ultimately you're making big environmental interventions. And in the isthmus, in a sense, in terms of UN standards, it's bare level poverty. But once you're living there, you're eating high quality fish. How you can eat and what you're eating is amazing, and people can eat and live well from the fishing and the farming there. But this is immediately being threatened by putting these projects in there, and is threatened to this day, because this problem has not ended in any way. Interestingly too, when I was on field work, and now there's a lot of empirical and also modeling research, is that everyone I talked to was there's a loss of rain. And now when there's high quantities of wind turbines, there's actually weather and climatic changes that are happening for them. And there's heating in the region, loss of rain, and this goes between 8 and 24 kilometers downwind of these projects. And here I imagine is maybe even more extreme because of the high level of wind turbines. So, and there's more studies on this, and we can talk about this in the Q&A. But this also leads to social discord in terms of, flooding money into the area, and also offering select information, only telling landowners, only going to politicians who then are more or less trying to sell out their community for the greater good or their own interests. It's up for your interpretation. The unequal distribution of money between landowners, which creates conflicts. It divides families straight through the middle of them. And when people resist and fight, there's just good old fashioned coercion and violence and threat of violence and the whole gamut. And so I've done a lot of work on this. So here are some kind of key attributes of actually how you're destroying a landscape, potentially a culture and people, and forcing them into the circuits of kind of capitalism. But so let's, as a sample, let's kind of get into this a bit more, because genocide is a very inflammatory term. People react very hard, like, oh, how can you call this genocide? And so let's talk about this. So the origin of the term comes from Ralph Lemkin in 1944, his Axis rule in occupied Europe. Genos meaning tribe or race of people, and the Latin side meaning killing. So it's tribe killing. So this can, especially, obviously the word tribe has an English colonial connotation that we must be kind of cautious of. But at the same time, this is very much geared towards how you can exterminate a people, a way of life, and beliefs. And so kind of Lemkin originally described genocide as a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups. For example, the sea and any means of subsistence, with the aim of annihilating the group themselves. But I think the real key kind of aspect to think about this is kind of this quote from Lemkin. Genocide has two phases. One, destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group, so destroying their way of life. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor, The imposition in turn may be based upon the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain, or upon the territory alone, after removal of the population and the colonization of the area by the oppressor's own nationals. So you see a reference to settler colonialism in there, but more importantly, you know, it's even a reference that not everyone needs to be destroyed or exterminated. Some people can stay integrated into a labor force, which might sound very familiar. So these are some kind of real foundations of actually understanding the original definition of genocide, of actually destroying or reconfiguring existing patterns to integrate them into the dominant culture, as we can call it, or yeah, we'll just call it, or the national pattern or dominant culture, we'll call it after Lemkin. But, and as we'll see in the next slide, the United Nations Convention on Genocide was an extremely political project in terms of how it was actually drafted. But here's kind of what came out of it. Here's some of the key kind of, obviously we can go into all these things for a long time, but here's kind of what came out of the UN Convention. You know, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of that group to another group. And so here's a picture of them signing this. But as many people have kind of raised, this kind of legal and realist kind of definition of genocide has been rather limited, extremely limited, and definitely departs from the earlier kind of definitions from Lemkin. And so there's been, so when I leave field work in Oaxaca, I'm like, oh my God, like I got to go talk about how wind turbines are continuing a process of colonial genocide. You know, this isn't something that's very popular you want to talk about. I mean, I spent years of people being super upset and still are about me being critical of low carbon infrastructures. And I want to say that I think low carbon infrastructures, if there's going to be energy production, is the best way to do it. But there's a lot of serious problems with it. And so I had to come back and I had to start looking at how can I honor the people that I've been working with and speaking to, who are telling me that this is genocide, ethnocide, and ecocide. And so luckily, the genocide studies actually had an amazing amount of tools to kind of do this. And a lot of this was really, I mean, first of all, we have to give credit. You know, a lot of this comes from indigenous people themselves who have been calling this out for centuries, you know, and also the colonists who deserted and saw that their culture was toxic and was seeing what was going on. But really, this comes from the indigenous people themselves. But in terms of the study, it comes from, you know, the big piece that really looked at this, what we call the post-liberal perspective on genocide studies or critical genocide studies, kind of begins, if not with indigenous people, Jean-Paul Sartre's On Genocide, that really called out the Vietnam War as a process of genocide and the colonial process. Likewise, the journalists Robert Davis and Mark Zanis, they wrote the theory of the genocide machine in 1973, looking at what Canada was doing to the Inuit and other groups in Canada, that more or less theorized actually how genocide is a continuing process, that it didn't stop with the Holocaust, and that it happened long before it, and it continued long after in terms of how it adapted to technology to actually control space, and if anything, seeing it as a different phase. And so these works were rather influential on scholars like Native American scholar Ward Churchill, who wrote A Little Matter of Genocide to look at the situation in Native North America. So this foundation really gave a burgeoning literature that came about, and the works of, I mean, Damien Short's work has been immensely influential. The work that he's done for over 10 years or more, really looking at the process of kind of colonial genocide. And this also, the works of Dirk Moses and most certainly Patrick Wolf have been kind of instrumental people to really look at this. And so what's important, so you have the liberal perspective, which we know, the Holocaust is the epitome of genocide. And, you know, the realist UN definitions, which have not done very well, and they made ethnic cleansing to avoid even using these terms to have kind of international action. Then there's the problem of having international action for geopolitical issues. But so there's the liberal side that's rather conservative, but the post-liberal kind of genocide studies has actually really challenged this. And the first is to acknowledge that when the UN Convention was being negotiated, there was something called the colonial clause between the United States and the Soviet Union that actually, because they're all guilty of genocide, wanted to actually sideline and put indigenous people of all their varieties and differences to a side to more or less excuse them of these crimes. And so this is rather serious. But then there's the other problem, is that when you situate the Holocaust as the epitome of genocide, it really suffers this extreme Eurocentrism that ignores the whole history of concentration camps, internment, and extermination that went on in the Africa, the Americas, everywhere. And so it's really privileging this horrible European moment, but when really there's much more long-term processes. And if you look at Hannah Arendt, for example, she referred to Nazism as the boomerang effect of what happened in the concentration camps in Namibia and coming back to Germany, not to mention the concentration camps in the Boer Wars in South Africa by the British. So there's a long history and there's long-term processes of genocide and extermination that are going on. And so the post-liberal perspective is really interested in looking at the long-term processes and how these look, and looking at the structural nature of genocidal and ecocidal processes. The other issue here is, where is the environment? So when you have these narrow definitions of genocide is, what is the impact on the environment and what's this having, as well as culture, ecology. So when Lemkin wrote the definitions, as the work of Damien Short shows very well, is that there was systematically eliminating the issues of culture, ignoring the impacts on the environments. And this kind of leads to the trifecta of colonialism, counterinsurgency, and genocide. And if you look at, the famous example are the buffaloes in Native North America, but ultimately it's standard military strategy and tactic to destroy the means of subsistence of people, to get them to break them to the will in any type of war or in a settler colonial war. And so these factors are really interesting in terms of how they interrelate and should be applied to actually how we understand mega projects is really where this is going. And so, yeah, one of the big things that prevents companies from being held accountable to the destruction that they make, whether it's low carbon infrastructures or hydrocarbon development or any type of mining, is really intentionality. How do you prove the intentionality of a company doing this? And obviously, companies aren't intentionally trying to exterminate people. They're geared towards profit. There's a legal measure to enforce them to gain more profits through their endeavors. But this is the thing, is that profit motives excuse extermination and the degradation of ecosystems. And this is maddening. This is crazy, especially given how serious, ecological and climate catastrophe has happened. And then kind of one of the other issues that post-liberal theorists or genocide theorists are really showing is that, genocide is more than just mass killing. It's not just massacres. It's not just trying to do scorched earth counterinsurgency policies. These are long-term processes about hollowing out and breaking people that go into this. And so, killing has so many ways, and there's so many ways you can break, hurt, and degrade people and their environments. And these things need to be talked about. So really, what really sums this up, and the way to look at this is Patrick Wolf's famous quote is that invasion is a structure, not an event. So that this is genocide and ecocide is a process that goes on over spans of time. And if we're looking at the way what's happening to different indigenous peoples still today and how these processes of extermination and land degradation are continuing, we have to remember that there's an entire operation of looting in place. And I think Patrick Wolf's quote is really important for us to kind of carry with us. So this is kind of the basic foundation of where I'm coming from. So let's delve into this a bit more about, 4 key developments and maybe some contentious points that I want to bring up here for the discussants and other people. And so really this is based on, it's more now, it's even more years than this and more sites. But this is coming from my experiences of working in Oaxaca for over 6 years or 7 years. And I have worked with Mr. X, who's an important person, and other people such as Martine, surrounded by wind turbines. I worked on coal mining in Germany, which was led by Andrea Brock, which is a great privilege to work with her, but we got to look at, an open cast coal mine in Germany. So very different locations. And again, I was in Peru looking at a copper mine that was in resistance for 10 years. This copper mine company was run by Grupo Mexico, who also owned wind parks in Oaxaca. So I was really interested in seeing, okay, they own wind parks to green their image, but what does it really take to get copper? And it was extremely violent. I still think of the tears and the trauma in people from hearing the last times they saw their dads before they were assassinated. And yeah, pretty brutal stuff. And again, there's detailed papers on all of this. And then even in France, I worked on energy transformers and these transnational kind of corridors and power lines and seeing the kind of dispositions there. But it's really thinking these first three instances that this is kind of where I'm coming from. So the Genocide Ecocide Nexus, this is a great, amazing kind of intervention by Damien Short, but also Martin Kröger, that really are showing that, you can't separate the two. You can't separate genocide from ecocide, and this really goes at the kind of the heart of kind of Western epistemology and approaches that tries to separate humans from nature, but really we're so connected and dependent on each other. And to try to ignore the ecological side is crazy in genocide studies. And so they've made a really important intervention that I hope more people kind of look at and take on. And so it's really asking, where are ecosystems and habitats in genocide studies? And this is really linking indigenous land relations to the project of extermination. So again, getting back to all these military and counterinsurgency strategies that are destroying ecosystems to win their wars, whether it's, killing buffaloes, burning crops, or napalming entire forests to really do everything they can to break a population that's living in the forest and trying to fight off colonial insurgency or state insurgency in their territories. But yeah, they say that the indigenous people and the people from those areas are the insurgents, but it's rather, a lot of the language is rather backwards. And this is really to connect counterinsurgency and military programs with targeting the environment for people. And this can't be stressed enough. And so I think that when you see real concerted efforts targeting the different areas where people live, this is really a gateway to say like, okay, this is when we start to really flirt with and enter a potential genocide and ecocidal politics. And for example, you hear things even around the Tia Maria mine, where they were throwing rocks at people and dropping tear gas out of helicopters. And I heard rumors of people setting, sometimes the tear gas was setting fields on fire, and a lot of their fight was to protect agriculture in the area against a copper mine. But when you start seeing fields getting burned and the means of subsistence with wind turbines destroying the different farming or the different areas, or with the fish, and again, the effect of electromagnetic currents on fish is highly contested, or in marine life in general, not just fish. So really looking at this attacking of the means of subsistence through kind of police and military programs is rather central to understanding and opening these things up to kind of a potential genocidal and ecocidal politics. And again, like I said, breaking the Western separation between people and ecosystems. And this is, remember, even if we live in cities and urban environments, and if we think food is born from the supermarket, we are one of this planet. We are dependent on these things, and we are these things. And when we hurt the planet and the different ecosystems, we're hurting ourselves. And we have to remember that. And the Genocide Ecocide Nexus is an important reminder of this to me. And this includes ecological and climate considerations in genocide studies. So what Mark and Damien did is they really opened up and are really bringing in kind of the ecological issues into genocide studies, which is important. And the next slide will really try to take this further as well. But so
20 minutes elapsed.
I'm sorry, what?
I said 20 minutes elapsed.
Ooh, I'm running out of time. All right. But again, attacks against ecosystems are attacks against culture, subsistence, and threatens existence. So where is political ecology in this? How come more people aren't talking about genocide and ecocide happening? What's the difference between this and a primitive accumulation and accumulation by dispossession? And I can tell you a lot of stories maybe we can get to later in terms of, how people, especially specifically Marxists, kind of approached what I was saying when I was talking about my work in Oaxaca. And so genocide studies, one can kind of criticize it for kind of a lack of fieldwork engagement, a bit armchair, emphasis on historical, and engaging in kind of simplistic kind of generalizations of kind of essentialism. It relies on specific natural cultures and things like this to kind of understand and chart where extermination is. And so there's a big problem of essentialism that's kind of well known within the studies. And then on the other side, you have political ecology, which is very locally detailed, yet avoids long-term kind of cumulative political framings. And so there's an eco-socialist politics in there that might prevent maybe bigger picture stuff. And so a lot of what this talk is about in general is actually combining and really undertaking really getting more kind of fieldwork based work to examine the complexities of what's going on in these areas and how there's actually a long-term degradation and extermination in these areas of different types of species, or as Kröger calls them existences. But so yeah, I'm going to move a bit quicker now. But so confronting anthropocentrism is kind of the next kind of contention, is that it doesn't really go far enough, even with the genocide ecocide nexus. You know, if the ecosystems are the web of life, how does species extinction fit into genocide studies? So this is to say that there's a real anthropocentrism within genocide studies that needs to be challenged if it's going to be more relevant for understanding ecological and kind of climactic issues. And that's the thing, is few genocides are ever complete, but there's many species extinctions that are. So this should really show clear and quick affinity to the importance of actually genocide studies looking at environmental aspects and really including more detailed field work. I mean, shouldn't species extinctions concern genocide studies? Of course, is what I'm trying to argue here. And how do we chart the real erasures we live in? You know, how do we actually understand what is truly being lost, especially when we have kind of standard biomedical epistemologies and kind of materialism in general, which really has hierarchies in terms of how it understands lived existence. And the genocide studies must challenge its ontologies, Western centrism, to understand the extermination and planetary change taking place. And one of the best things I've read really recently is Markus Kröger's The Political Economy of Existences, is his phrase in his recent book, really talking about this, and hopefully he talks about it some more. And really this goes to kind of the idea of anarchist political ecology, is that when you create environments of subjugation and domestication, like factory farms or anything like this, it's all a matter of time before this is setting a precedent to continue these things before you begin doing it to other people, species, and environments. And so this is maybe an interesting way to think about it. So 3, confronting complexity in the field. So Patrick Wolf, in no real kind of linear order, kind of describes the genocidal process in 3 phases. You know, conquest, terrorism, extermination, in any variety of the ways. 2, you have kind of confinement and control, characteristic of concentration camps and reservations, to actually really begin enforcing certain values and controlling people. And then you have 3, the assimilation phases of more enlightenment and missionary style phases. Not that those are, none of these are separate, you know, they're all combined, where there's a more kind of enlightened approach to understanding these things with people. And for me, one of the challenges I had, so when I'm working in indigenous communities or in more kind of agricultural areas with, of course, has many different identities in it, is I add to this the self-management phase, which is really an intensification of the assimilation phase, which is kind of saying that assimilation is intensifying to such a degree that control is becoming economized. It's becoming so people are internalizing it and managing it themselves and can't see past it. I'm sorry, I'm gonna go over a little bit over. But this explains kind of contradictions and variegated absorptions into kind of dominant cultures in terms of their allegiance to them, and how people are committed to actually fighting and keeping really what are oppressive circumstances for everyone, human and non-human. And obviously we can think about, you know, Trump voters and things like that, and the white working class in the United States that has literally internalized their oppression to a degree and are reprojecting it in ways that is completely against their interests. And this is really kind of the issue to really understand and break identity essentialism. You know, I've worked in many different areas. It's not as simple as what decolonial cultural studies often says, that, you know, there's black and brown good and indigenous good and white bad. It's far more complex in these conflict areas. And it's super treacherous to think that way, because you're going to see every type of indigenous, conservative, patriarch, capitalist, and authoritarians trying to run land and control their own people, working with different politicians and hit squads and things like this. So part of this is a way to really try to understand how people and environments are being absorbed and ultimately betraying themselves for ideas of money and a type of modernism that has really serious consequences, as climate change reminds us. And yeah, and again, it's humans betraying themselves, their land, and for short-term gain. So I'm maybe going to skip over this a bit, but I think one way to really look at this is the term I coined, infrastructural colonization, and Martina and I really expanded on this in Oaxaca to look at it. But it's taking what Wolf said, you know, invasion is a structure, and saying invasion is infrastructural as well, and how the mining that goes into destroying these areas also goes into kind of remaking these patterns of domination through infrastructure, which of course have radios and telecommunication and have enchanting benefits, but they also have serious costs. And we're kind of addicted and completely dependent on them, and it makes it difficult to kind of go through. And so, yeah, and it's important to say, you know, in material cultures, they started referring to the evil environments of subways or border walls or airports as non-spaces, but it's important to say, like, no, these are actually coding environments with specific values that have impacts and are alive and carrying certain values forward. And it's to also stress that through colonial or neo-colonial times, infrastructure has a long life. It outlasts many humans all the time. And so there's a continuity between colonial ventures and actually forcing through these kind of projects and the infrastructures that we have and how they're developing. And really that infrastructure, especially when they become an apparatus, they're networked and they're continuing kind of a permanent social war and changing and reinforcing people's values in terms of kind of integrating into the dominant culture. And again, we can talk about some of this stuff more. And so this reshapes and dominates different kind of ecosystems, domesticates peoples, manufactures desires, and cultivates socio-cultural homogenization. But again, I'm moving a bit fast because I talk too much. And really, maybe kind of the harder and heavier point, we're getting closer to the end, is, you know, why the implicit rejection of the colonial continuity and genocide ecocide process and political ecology. You know, why do gentle political framings proliferate in the face of socio-ecological and climate catastrophe? And so there's many ways we can approach this, but I think positionality is a really good place to begin. And so really this means if you do not see, let alone feel political antagonism, if you don't have a connection with the land, if you don't have a connection with another way of seeing the world, if you grow up with smartphones and are very much integrated into an industrial and technological culture, you know, why would you see much of a problem with it, especially with the enchantment of fast food, the amazing feeds of endorphins we get from video games and computers and our emails and cell phones, even though they might leave us hollow in different moments. And so this is really to raise the issue of self-identification with modernity, extraction, and technology, and to really have us ask that in ourselves, and also with university structures that we all know are highly abusive and run us into the ground. I'm sick right now from trying to overwork and perform the best I can to kind of survive and exist in my little world. And so how does one identify the colony or coloniality and the genocide ecocide nexus? Like, I think so really, the genocide and ecocide is going to appear extreme to you if you identify with these things, if you want and self-identify with these forms of government, the state, and industrial regimes and forms of technology. Of course, if you see these and self-identify with them and see you participating in them, then this is going to sit odd with you, and you're not going to see the levels of destruction taking place. And, you know, what is the specific target and how does it manifest immediately, you know? So really understanding what's being targeted, you know, understanding the utilitarianism and architecture, the ideology of progress, you know, where are these things? And so when we talk about decolonization, you know, how are we really looking at this and how we live in the relationships there and the infrastructures that we use? And again, decolonial theory, knowledge based on lived experience, thinking, place, locations of those communities, super important. But politics also matter. You know, it can't be the stuff that Mignolo and them are doing that are really like stressing identity based, are in support of China's Belt and Road Initiative because it's de-Westernizing. You know, we really have the politics, authoritarian or anti-authoritarian and all the shades in between are going to really matter in terms of how we relate to the land, each other, and how we organize our forms of post-development or degrowth or any of these things, but just really any way to actually live in harmony again. And this is just stress all the different political isms that are operating behind different kind of lived identities. And it's important that I think really stressing the political and creating what we want to create and how we live and move, which is so hard as an academic because it makes you such a horrible hypocrite. And yeah, and this comes down to really behind a lot of these kind of conversations is the timeless dichotomy. Obviously it's a false one, but it's also useful here, is assimilation versus insurrection. Are we trying to integrate, get more rights, get more protections from the state and these things, or do we really want to create a situation that thwarts off our dependencies and addictions and creates something that's more in balance with our values and our ecosystems? So again, these are questions that will be below and amongst the identities in terms of how we live and move. Second to last slide, so we're getting there. But really, positionality in the academy, you know, this gets even harder. And this is really a stab at myself and all the other researchers and people out there. You know, the issue of academic conditioning, abuse and survival, you know, the microcosm of capitalist society. The university is is this. Foucault said this, many others before and around him, and it's, you know, we talk about decolonizing the university, but there's not enough emphasis on the infrastructure and the real structural problems that are there. Meanwhile, everyone's struggling to survive and exist in these things. And really just, and my concern, and maybe with this topic, is just these careerist ambitions equal self-policing and control. You know, people are constantly, you know, the phrase, you know, once I complete my PhD, or once I get a tenured position, you know, then I'll really speak my mind. And it doesn't work like that. You're going to be broken down and conditioned, and we're constantly being domesticated, I would argue, by being a part of these processes, and we're not speaking really truly to what's happening in the world, and really maybe failing to see the effects it's really having on us. But again, that depends where you start and how you feel and how you self-identify. So it's a very personal thing. And, you know, this idea of objectivity, can there be objectivity when we're colonized by industrial cybernetic infrastructures? You know, we're working in universities based on central heating. You know, we're coming from very particular, like, industrial and technological cultures, you know, and I think many of us, at least some, are very critical of it, but we're not even sure how to fight it. And it works in some moments, but it's how can we actually produce sensitive and engaged research and really even understand the implications to seeing the potential of exterminating processes if we're engulfed in these types of infrastructures and so dependent on them as academics. And then who understands, let alone can talk to the autonomous and anarchist insurgents in the area? And so a big problem I've seen is the amount of kind of liberal work being produced. And it's because a lot of the dangerous fighters and recalcitrant fishermen and farmers and different people, they don't want to speak to academics. They see giant red flags. But there's a real ignoring of these perspectives and positions, which are, they may not be the majority, but sometimes they are. But this kind of aspect, and a lot of my work is kind of focused and tried to really listen and understand that perspective, is there's a huge blind spot for it. And of course, there's tons of exceptions, but there's definitely in terms of the production of academic literature. And then there's also the kind of the activist labeling and self-labeling, you know, in terms of being scholar academics or activist scholars and things like this, you know, or anarchist academics. And it's actually very interesting because we don't have statist economists. We don't have, you know, statist academics. We don't have fascist academics. And so it's interesting how this kind of labeling, you know, in one sense, it's separating ourselves. It's pushing things from actually existing and being kind of closer into the mainstream. Meanwhile, at the same time, maybe the benefit is that it can be a publishing niche or something like this. But at the same time, I think there's real issues with this kind of, you know, how one identifies and how one labels either, and how they use different kind of separations. Cool. Last slide. I might have gone over time a bit, but I really want to end this with this. And this comes from actually one of Martine's colleagues at their school over there. And I'm going to just read it to you. And I think this really brings up a lot of kind of what this is going in the more controversial point. And as Carlos Manzo writes, you know, great Zapotec author, clearly the 20th century Mexican governmental model used for implementing development in our Isthmus of Tehuantepec region obstructs, negates, destroys, and disappears our nations. So it is by all means a genocide, but it is also public policy, and those policies call us indigenous. Therefore, the term ethnocide is also fitting. It is also fitting, but I would stick with genocide because ethnocide is specifically for native groups. But here the killings are not making a distinction. And here's the main point. Anyone living in a region near this new infrastructure is being targeted for the sake of development and the current national priority for energy generation. So the key thing here, and this really speaks across all the areas I've ever worked, if you're committed, if you have a relationship with the land, if you're in resistance, either organizing or taking direct action, you're going to be targeted to be neutralized. Sometimes that's just with legal fees, sometimes that's with threats, sometimes it's with killing, depending on your effectiveness. And I mean, and it's, or maybe not effectiveness, but the high profile nature. And so it's to really stress that really anyone that goes against these kind of projects or these things are being targeted. And this raises and really ups the level alongside ecological catastrophe and climate change. So yeah, I just like to say to really look at the extent of this problem. And that's what these terms are to do, and to really see where they are, and to also reflect in ourselves, to acknowledge actually how conservative still the conversation is in academia, and to stress that there's no easy solution and really only experiments and committed struggles to create socially and ecologically vital and healthy political ecologies for us. But I really hope that we can look at this and there can be more dialogue between these studies. And I thanks so much everyone for your time. And I greatly look forward to hear from the other discussants here. Thank you.
That is always missing from these Zoom spaces is you can't hear us all clapping, because I'm sure that everybody is clapping, and if we were in a traditional space, then we would be clapping for you. So thank you very much. And if you can see in the chat, there are a lot of really positive thanks coming in from the presentation. So now we're going to hear from our three discussants. And our first discussant is Martin Correa-Arce, and he was born in the Yucatan Peninsula, where he grew up witnessing the gentrification of the Mayans coast and the jungles. He studied history in the Universidad Veracruzana during the years when the water-rich basin of the Cofre de Petro mountain was taken over by armed groups in favor of Nestle. In 2013, he began studying the geopolitics of Oaxaca in the Longue Durée, moving there shortly afterward. And he is currently one of the founding professors in the Universidad Autonoma Comunal de Oaxaca, where he pursues the research lines of contemporary geopolitics, Mesoamerican linguistics, and ecosystems and power institutions. So without further ado, I yield the floor to Martin.
Thank you very much for being here today. So yes, the name of the webinar, the conference, it's quite interesting and provoking, because it makes us look into aspects of everyday life that may be bothersome if we think about them, if we dwell upon them, because they're there, and the most common thing is not to be aware of them, and that is part of the success of the reproduction of these forms of exploitation and of colonization of the land, that many of the things are hidden to the eyes, and they are sold as something else. So, well, here in the case where we're speaking, or the cases that I can witness, the area called as Mesoamerica has been subject to the colonial projects for hundreds of years, and while it's easy to think that the colonial project is something that ended or that happened hundreds of years ago, the reality is that today is the colonial project is something that we are experiencing, and that it's taking a big toll in deaths, in lives, in ecosystems, and in, yes, basically the well-being of the ecosystems, which are being damaged, and therefore all of the living beings and not living processes that happen on those ecosystems are being destroyed. Now, for example, the region called as the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, since the Spanish came 500 years ago, Hernán Cortés, in a letter to the king, he said that that the region is straight as narrow, so that it would be a perfect place to build a canal in the future, or to make a pathway to be able to move goods and merchandises across both oceans. So 500 years ago, the Trans-Seismic Corridor that is nowadays being built by the president, and that he's using it as his flag for national development, it's an idea that that popped into the head of the first colonizers of the region 500 years ago. So the Mexican state, as being the former actor that is instituting the colonizing project there in the region, is giving continuity to that corridor. So, well, in the big picture, we can hear names or terms like genocide, or like genocide or ecocide, which we know they are about wiping out or drastically changing the patterns of humans, and generally just moving them to other places, forcing migrations or big population arrangements. So how does this operate in the daily lives of people? You know, how does this translate to the micropolitics of the psychology of people that are being changed or transformed or being wiped out? Well, here in the case of well, first, categories are important. So that is why after the Second World War ended, the category Third World was coined. And the difference between a first world and a third world, which was developing countries. You know, that term over there, when you name or you label something as developing, that means that it's gonna have politics that are gonna be accomplishing that. So you have to make maps of the different actors that are halting this development or that are making it difficult, and those actors need to be eliminated or transformed. So there is the hard approach, in which the elimination is done by force, and then there's the counterinsurgency soft approach, in which a process is done in decades, in a matter of decades, in which the people are convinced that their way of living is not that is barbarian, or that is idiotic, or that is not civilized, and that it needs to be changed. So here, both approaches are applied, and that are able, and we are able to witness on the daily lives. For example, how does this translate? Well, for example, here in Mexico, we have that the countries, the United States and the United States of Mexico, called Northern Mexico, they signed a treaty. They've been signing treaties or agreements for since both countries were invented. But in the year 2001, they signed the Merida Initiative. And the Merida Initiative, it was announced in the year 2007, actually. And and there it's called an agreement of security agreement, yeah, a security cooperation agreement. But what does that mean is that that not only weapons but also trainment and counseling, on the field counseling to protect the investments, the investments of all of these mega projects, because mining companies or water companies such as Nestle or others, they want something that can, they want to feel that their investment is assured, that they want to minimize the risks of the investment being lost. That's why those agreements of cooperation seek to give security to those investments. So the risk of the investment being going broken are put on the table. And for example, if we have presence of native nations that are in the area and that may be against the project, or you have population, big population of young people that are into rebellious music that is considered rebellious, or that are in age groups that are considered groups like saying above 16 years to the 35 years, in which in the event of being a conflict, those young people could enter the conflict in favor of their communities. So all of these groups are targeted. And
about 2 minutes to wrap up, please.
And they are generally eliminated by what they're called the cartels, that are cartels or narco groups. But the thing is that those cartels or narco groups should not be considered isolated or part of a business or of an industry, which is what the media generally makes. They pitch it as narcos being kind of like entrepreneurs that are quite violent and that they negotiate with the state. This is not true. This is just a media construction. And what happens is that initiatives like Merida Initiative or those agreements actually they translate that those military training or that security training creates these kind of groups that are called extrajudicial forces, and they're the ones that they are operating the security of the capital of the investments, and they systematically target those groups in the population. So it's not a matter of what your name is or your personal history. If you're between age range or a social range, if you live in certain neighborhoods or communities, you are a target of being eliminated, systematically eliminated to protect those investments. And that training for those groups sometimes occurs even outside of the country. There are many oral accounts of those groups being taken to places like Iraq or Syria or in the Middle East, where they serve in operations along mercenary companies, corporations that assist the countries that are there in, well, fighting in those countries. So the many of the cold sicarios or the armed men that are operating here, many of them get their training. They serve some months in the Middle East, and then they're returned to these countries where they will continue to do all of those disrupting of the social tissue, so that the people to force a shock, like a shock doctrine on the population, which enables the population to act against or to organize against mining or water corporations such as Nestlé, where organizing is not an option when there are armed groups like narco groups moving methamphetamine, which happens to have a big there's a lot of money that promotes the use of this drug. For example, there's a blockbuster Netflix series that many people watch called Breaking Bad, in which in Breaking Bad, methamphetamine is cool. You know, that's the drug of the hero of the series. And it's many people here in our country will watch that series. So the drug that those groups that are trained by the United States they're moving around, their merchandise has a big, it's patronized big. I mean, not everyone can have their product with a series in Netflix. I mean, if your product has its own series in Netflix, you have some big patrocination there. So that's why the problem here is not with local politics. It's something that is beyond them, and that the presidents or governors or like nobody in the government structure can really do anything about it, you know, because what's moving around, it's way bigger.
Thank you,
So,
Martin, so much for these insights, and we really appreciate this, like, what you've given us, these insights into like the on-the-ground experience. I do apologize at the moment. We're going to have to move to our next discussant, but I definitely hope that we get to hear more about this further in the presentation. So thank you so much.
No, thank you.
So I am going to invite our next discussant to the floor. I'm going to give just a very quick little contextualization of who we are going to be hearing from next. So thank you so much. And our next speaker, we have Sakshi Aravind, who is a PhD student in the Department of Land Economy at the University of Cambridge. She works on Indigenous environmental justice in Australia, Brazil, and Canada. Her research areas include legal and Indigenous geographies, comparative environmental law, multi-species justice, and political ecology. So, Sakshi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I'm very happy for this opportunity to converse about collective of issues that are profoundly disturbing, but also rife with theoretical interest and potentials. I might sound obnoxiously abstract, but that's the nature of work I do. I think Alexander's articles do a very good job of covering a large ground of the intimate and destructive relationship between extraction, colonialism, and environmental destruction. A relationship is destructive not amongst themselves. The mutual bond between mining, ecocide, and genocide often tends to strengthen as long as the conditions of expropriation and accumulation exist, but destroy all else around them. I'm also looking forward to hearing from Markus later, as I just started reading his new book, Extractivism, Existences, and Extinctions, and it's a rich material and an unlikely encounter in the Anglophone scholarship. having had such a close look at Brazilian socio-political context, the scholarship itself, both your work is situated in the global south and not merely visited, and there are several thematic overlaps which will be useful for our contemplations today. I am a legal theorist, and I'm wondering what more can I bring to this discourse that frequently generates some degree of abstract consensus, some being the operative word, around extractive capitalism and colonialism. Well, for starters, in my work, I have to invariably look at the epistemic conditions on which these terms are conceived and how they branch out. And also, I must emphasize on the pragmatic usefulness and application of genocide and ecocide and so on. Once you bring up these terms, there will be an attendant question of who needs them and what do we need it for. There's a relatively easier task of theorizing genocide and ecocide than attaching culpability to them with an intent to prosecute and punish. When I say theorizing, that's an exclusive question of recognition and moral culpability without any immediate or even short-term legal consequences. In recent times, the element of destruction has obtained noticeable scholarly attention, especially in light of recent extreme weather events and bushfires around the world. When the scale of death and destruction are so palpable, so visible, it is indeed hard to miss. Australia's Black Summer of 2020 resulted in large swathes of forests being burned and witnessed an unprecedented scale of loss of non-human lives. Academic and writer Daniel Sellermaher has termed this wanton destruction of non-human lives and connections we cherish with the environment as omnicide, killing everything, where destruction is more a matter of means than motives. I often lean on Elizabeth Bovinelli's work, given her close and just collaborations with the communities she writes about, and extent of her participation in their everyday lives and the conscious ways in which she foregrounds indigenous cosmologies and epistemologies in her scholarship. For Bovinelli, the settler state in late liberalism operates between letting live, killing, and letting die, which are both useful and expansive framework for how we understand the cumulative events of planetary collapse. There's less a question of intent in these conversations around genocide and ecocide, the unraveling of complex forms of interaction between extractive capitalism and settler colonialism, and subsequently emergent forms of settler capitalism, are designed in forms that can only function through killing and letting die. Invariably, there's a rich understanding of how erasures and extinctions happen in indigenous voices than through mediated voices from others, especially through academia. While we appreciate the breadth of scholarship on how destruction of environment, ecology, natural resources fit in or should fit into the existing frameworks of genocide, the semantic field is also overpopulated by predominantly white or Western scholars and theorists. Before I move on to talking about extraction law and juridical spaces, there's a small observation to be made about how we must move forward while working on genocide or ecocide in our work. Epistemic justice is a conscious choice and conscious sets of acts as well. We as academics must learn from and speak with indigenous peoples, read and cite indigenous scholars in what we may term as purely academic work. There's already a big deal of gatekeeping on what qualifies as academic work and text. There's so little avenue for bringing in work and voices of those who are technically not inhabiting the academic spheres anyway. Perhaps it is a good time to wonder if our citational practices are just in how we theorize and frame the interaction between extractive capitalism and settler colonialism, instead of holding on to what we know or how we would want these to be framed. When Zoe Todd writes ontologies are the word for colonialism, or when Claire Coleman or Chelsea Vertego show us how white Western scholarship now occupies the space that once flaunted Aboriginal remains in colonizers' museums and homes, they're also cautioning us against the language of solidarity that's not entirely innocuous. Indigenous experiences and scholarship have a remit that is outside of massacres, erasures, and resistance, or even settler colonial structures. Neither the legislative definitions nor the well-meaning extensions of these frameworks in non-Indigenous scholarship can quite substitute the expression of what Otto Simpson calls as politics of refusal and fear of social and political death. As Kyle White states in the context of developing green or sustainable energy alternatives without accounting for Indigenous voices, forces of domination render even the most well-intentioned solutions ineffective. It goes without saying we cannot let that happen to our work. With that preachy bit out of the way, I can now briefly take you through what the geological spaces can do when there are epistemic and institutional closures to hear claims against extractive and colonial violence. Tarek Alfred suggests that the root problem created by colonialism is a breakdown of bonds and social relations within Indigenous communities and between Indigenous peoples and, to quote, our land and traditional ways of life. All of these can be recognized, but can hardly make anyone legally culpable. So we go back to the initial question of what is it we want from identifying the nexus between extraction and varied forms of destruction. If genocide does not look like its original definition, which has birthed in specific geopolitical contexts, then the remedies are not going to be familiar either. The objective of Indigenous voices, who's always claimed genocide was a fundamental settler colonial project, has been, the remedies have looked in the form of reparation, repatriation, compensation, recognition of sovereignty, and reconciliation. As academic of the Stolo Nation, Lee Maracle once observed, without rematriation of Indigenous territories, all conversations about collective radical futures are futile. Whilst Indigenous people strive towards obtaining a powerful voice that can alter or transform the juridical spaces, their effort has gone towards chipping away at the periphery of settler legality and making it unstable just enough to demand fresh liquid integrity, legitimacy, and conceptions of rule of law. With genocide of Indigenous people, there's something deeper and more sinister than legal terms and doctrines that may capture culpability. It is an apparatus of complex annihilation. So Bazakot versus Morgan was one of the earliest cases against extractive industries to be argued in Australia. So the case was contested before a single judge bench in South Australian Supreme Court in 1999. The plaintiff, Aboriginal elder Kevin Bazakot, had made multiple applications seeking declaratory reliefs and injunctions against the defendant's mining company. The relief sought also included a claim that the unremitting operations of the mining corporation had caused irreparable harm to the people of Arabian land. The plaintiff sought to represent the Arabian people and claimed that the operations of mining corporation amounted to genocide. The affidavit by the plaintiff was extensive, arguing that the destruction of the land and traditional land and people's cultural and spiritual life amounted to systemic erasure of the Aboriginal people. The claimant sought to implicate more than the mining corporation, as the declaratory relief was also sought against the state that had enabled mining companies to operate on the Aboriginal land. More importantly, the plaintiff also filed an application for direction seeking orders to refer the matter to the Supreme Court's full bench and order the hearing at Lake Eyre. This particular claim intended to communicate to the settler court the urgency of the issue, the significance and intimacy of the evidence given on Aboriginal land, and the symbolic resistance of Aboriginal people to physically enter the settler juridical spaces. Predictably, the court could not grant any relief sought. Either the applications were dismissed or no orders were made. The details of the affidavit were well documented in the case, as the presiding judge, Justice Nyland, engages with each of the claims at length, appearing sympathetic with the plaintiff at times. Instead of outright dismissal, the judge is extremely understanding of the gravity of the claims made. In the same year, there was another petition made claiming the entire Australian project state sovereignty was guilty of genocide, and he sought to prosecute John Howard, the then Prime Minister of Australian nation, which also failed. But I think there was an extremely understanding judge, Justice Crispin, who said there's a proof of genocide before me, which I clearly see, but this court does not have jurisdiction to try these issues. So despite the obscurity and vagueness of both these petitions by Buzzer Court, this is one of the first cases to have explored new ways of indigenous resistance to extractive industries before courts, documenting the sincerest expression of indigenous perception of mining companies on their land. And fast forward to 2021, we have a fascinating decision in Sharma versus Minister for Environment, where the federal court held that the minister owed a duty of care to the children of Australia, while making decisions regarding which coal mining projects should be granted a go-ahead, while also maintaining commitment to emissions reduction. There are no indigenous claimants in this case, but instead we have an extremely self-reflective court that calls for common law and courts to be more mindful of the times we live in. In one of the insightful paragraphs, Justice Bromberg observes, it is difficult to characterize in a single phrase the devastation that the plausible evidence presented in this proceeding forecasts for the children. As Australian adults know their country, Australia will be lost and the world as we know with it gone as well. The physical environment will be harsher, far more extreme and devastatingly brutal when angry. As for the human experience, quality of life, opportunity to partake in nature's treasures, the capacity to grow and prosper, all will be greatly diminished. Lives will be cut short. Trauma will be far more common and good health harder to hold and maintain. None of this will be the fault of nature itself. It will be largely be inflicted by the inaction of this generation of adults in what might fairly be described as the greatest intergenerational injustice ever inflicted by one generation of humans upon the next. Well, that is a significant shift in sentiments coming from a court that to all within 2 decades. I think I should wrap this up quickly, lest I should be tempted to talk about every case that's in my thesis, but it would be remiss if I do not mention how courts are beginning to reckon with colonial past and present in juridical spaces. In 2021, the case of R versus this hotel, the Supreme Court of Canada was faced with the question of whether the respondent, who was American, was Aboriginal, and if yes, did he have the hunting rights within Canada because of his claim for belongingness to Canadian Aboriginal group. Without going into the issues of the case, the claim was answered in affirmative and this hotel won, to be brief. But what interests us in the following observation, where the court does more than its predecessors have ever done to understand the effect of colonization of the First Nations. I quote from the judgment. I would add that an interpretation of Aboriginal peoples of Canada under Section 35 of the Constitution that includes Aboriginal peoples who were here when the Europeans arrived and later moved or forced to move elsewhere, or on whom international boundaries were imposed, reflects the purpose of reconciliation. The displacement of Aboriginal peoples as a result of colonization is well acknowledged. Aboriginal peoples were displaced physically. They were denied access to their traditional territories and in many cases, actually forced to move to new locations selected for them by colonial authorities. They were also displaced socially, culturally, subject to intensive missionary activity and the establishment of residential schools, which undermined their ability to pass on traditional values to their children, imposed male-oriented Victorian values, and attacked traditional activities such as significant dances and other ceremonies. So similar sentiments, but even greater honesty were expressed in the case of Thomas Sykes First Nation versus British Columbia, decided by the British Columbian Supreme Court earlier this year, in the beginning of January. The decision went so far as to wonder how the racist colonial foundations of Aboriginal title can be relied on over and over again without recognizing the sovereignty of First Nations. To end this talk, finally, there are no compulsions that just and radical futures must happen in a single stroke of legal reform or breakthrough of an impossible political negotiation, even when the matters of such negotiation are very intricate to us or to even to academic framing. There are other strategic avenues to achieve the same end. These may be incremental efforts such as mass tort litigation for compensating stolen generation. All of that is worth remembering and building on for the sake of communities that we are working with and for averting this planetary crisis that stare us in the face. So thank you very much. That's from me. Over to you, Sophia.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. We really appreciate your contribution and also bringing us into a different space in terms of geopolitical space. So thank you so much. The next discussant and our last discussant for today that I would like to invite to the floor is Markus Kröger. Markus is an associate professor of global development studies in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Helsinki. He is also one of the founding members of the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative, EXALT. He has written extensively on global natural resource politics, conflicts, and social resistance movements to the outcomes, especially in relation to iron ore mining and forestry. So, Markus, the floor is yours for about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and thanks, Xander and Martin, Sakshi, for the great comments beforehand and presentations. So, yeah, maybe about those two articles that Xander sent on this wind energy expansion in Mexico. So what was striking for me is like reading from there also this fact that the most of the energy is actually exported directly to the US to companies such as Walmart and so on. So in the global situation, we don't have really a kind of decoupling from the so-called brown energy to so-called green energy. But the current like expansion of these kind of wind energy mills and so on comes on top of the existing consumption. So there's a big problem there in terms of need for degrowth and absence of that, just expanding these very destructive processes, destructive for the local people, all the other living beings on those spaces and those spaces themselves to be able to sustain life and continue to sustain life there and also globally in other places. And of course, these are also linked to mining. In the papers, Xander also mentions the great demand for all kind of cement and metals to build those wind energy installments. So yeah, there are these concrete impacts there from or along the whole chain of production here on this expanding production. Then yes, I think this is quite useful to use this concept of genocide, ecocide, ethnocide in the current context. For example, in the Amazon with the expansion of gold mining in different forms. Currently, so-called artisanal or small-scale mining, which is not so small scale anymore. It's really expanding very fast now. For example, in Venezuela, in the Orinoco Delta, a real great destruction there on indigenous lands, especially with the mercury impacts in the rivers, and then the wholesale deforestation that is causing, leaving kind of barren and toxic landscapes behind it, this kind of extractivism. And you have that kind of expansion also in different parts of Brazil and Peru as well. In Brazil, just in the very recently, during the past month, there has been a turning of the river Tapajós, which used to be very clear and bright. You could see 2 meters deep into a kind of muddy river, most likely because of the upriver gold mining along the shores of the Tapajós and its tributaries, and that those machines are using now a much bigger. They are kind of excavating the river sheds there, the size of the rivers on the indigenous lands illegally, and that is like changing the whole river perhaps irreversibly into a muddy river. So those are really sad situations, like those places that I discussed, for example, in that latest book that was mentioned. It's like around Santarém, they are considered one of the most beautiful freshwater areas of the world, with sandy beaches and so on. So and then it has to be mentioned that there's a kind of like a real war against the Yanomami right now with the Bolsonaro regime, like letting the illegal gold miners enter into their territories there. Tens of thousands of miners have entered and so on. So yeah, I think it's no exaggeration to talk about genocide in these situations, and also ecocide, which is even broader, and so on. So here's the cover of the book that was mentioned. So in this book, I suggest that we need a kind of like complementary theory to study. It's an open access book, so you can read it for free. It's to study political economy. So there's a need, for example, to change or challenge a lot of the current use of vocabularies, such as when you are studying, for example, meat production, you talk about the volume of meat produced, or then you talk about protein companies and so on, but you don't really want to give light to the fact that you have actually like living beings here that are being traded and so on, and so on. So there's a lot of euphemisms here, like the whole destruction of entire forests or removal of forests. In Finland, for example, there are all kind of terms that are used to this, like which try to hide the fact that forests are being destroyed, like calling like that you would actually be caring for forests while you are actually removing the forest with all its whole ensemble of beings and the ways of living there. So I ask that or suggest that there are like 4 key questions that can be asked when doing this kind of research on the political economy of existences. First is to ask like who or what can exist in that given setting before and after the extractivist expansion. So for example, you have an expansion of an open pit mine in a very rich forest area, like iron ore mines in the tropics are typically situated in rainforest areas. So you have a dramatic transformation in terms of what can exist in the barren landscape. Only like some humans who come there to work and actually exist based on that land after that. So then the second question is, what is their quality of existence? How can they exist? There are major changes in this also for people, like for labor and so on, when you have those kind of extractivist expansions. And especially also for animals and so on. In the book in itself, I talk mostly about monoculture plantation expansion in the Amazon in Brazil, but also a little bit about mining in Peru and forestry in Finland. Then the third question is like, in which time can they exist? Or how long can they exist? Because these like kind of like considerations of how time flows, like the rhythm of life typically changes when you have this hectic expansion of, for example, monoculture plantations, when you have the routine spraying of poisons on those fields so that nothing else can live there except the soybean or corn plant that is being planted. And then that is linked also to the kind of like feedlot facilities for chicken in nearby to the soybean fields, for example, where you have tens of thousands of factory animals there in a certain kind of rhythm. And then the fourth question is to ask that who can decide, who can make decisions about those rights to exist. Yeah, so I suggest that those can be studied for different regions where that kind of expansions of extractivisms are happening. And so on. And you could also scale those questions for in the global sense, like across the whole so-called commodity chain, for example. So you can study, for example, the soybean complex, looking at what happens at the fields of extraction, and then in the logistical networks, like along that Tapajos River that I was mentioning, when you have the barges shipping the soybeans there and all that, those impacts kind of accumulate along the whole river system, from the fields, cleared up fields, from deforestation, the mud and silt that comes through that. And then what happens at the sources of import, for example, in China, Europe, at the feedlots, how is life reordered there, and the life of the workers, and so on. And then also the consumers, how their lives are different. for example, eating habits, how those change with this fast food regime to which that cheap feed production is linked to. And then, of course, the afterlife, the garbage, so-called garbage, or absence of recycling and those kind of toxic like lagoons that are, for example, left behind from those feedlots. And these can be asked also for mining and the many poisons that are used there and their impacts in different types of mining. In the book, I also propose that you should study different kinds of extractivisms and their different degrees and different characteristics. So it's kind of like an attempt to make a link between these studies on existences of genocide, ecocide, political ontology, and then extractivisms and so on. Maybe I will now stop and leave time for further questions from the audience and also from the other panelists too, so that we can discuss. And thank you, Sophia, for the wonderful coordination.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Markus, for those thoughts. And if anybody is interested in reading Markus's new book, which, as he mentioned, is open access, I've put a link directly to it in the chat. So I invite everybody to check it out. It is a really good book. So I'd like to invite all of our discussants back to the stage. I'm just asking Martin to start his video and we'll bring him back too. And yeah, so we have about 25 minutes left together here today. And I think it might be best if our participants in the audience, if you have a question that you would like to ask, if you could please utilize the raise hand function, and we will then invite you to the floor. But first, there is one question that came in via the chat that they are not able to ask with their voice because they're in a public place right now. But I wanted to relay the question from Daniel Boston, and I guess whomever wants to take this one can. But they were wondering, what are the pros and cons of working with such a loaded concept when communicating with a broader audience or an audience beyond academia? Do you advocate sticking with this genocide ecocide frame?
I mean, is the question to me?
Well, I think the question is to whomever wants to answer it, but if you'd like to take the first crack, definitely please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's really context specific. I think it's important to use it in that way, you know, and I think there is a real issue of making sure that you're kind of honoring the term and kind of where it came from. And yeah, and obviously if you mention this in Germany, people react very hard and it's not nice. And like I was mentioning during the presentation, I would kind of go around and throw this thesis at everyone during my doctoral thesis. And, you know, my experience was there was kind of political ecology, Marxian influenced political ecologists who would be like, oh yeah, you know, like, you know, primitive accumulation or accumulation by dispossession is definitely either is or flirting with genocide ecocidal politics. And then there was other people who would just freak out and scream at me that's a class issue and kind of engage in kind of typical and cliche now kind of Marxian responses to some of these issues. But I mean, I think it has to be used carefully and, you know, to try to respect it. But I mean, a lot of why it's used and what I said is to really stress that look at what's happening to the world, you know, look at where it is, look at how much is kind of being destroyed. And I'm really, a lot of what that 2020, or I think it came out online first for the politics of ecocide and genocide article. I think Markus's book, and I read it like a couple of weeks ago. I think it really filled that line with the political economy of existences in terms of how you can actually research and advance and connect these studies a bit more in terms of really looking at what's being destroyed and also highlighting, and I can't agree more, the problem of materialism in terms of this framework and approach to understanding landscapes and people in terms of how much the kind of the basis of materialism is really just trying to exclude and destroy. It already implicitly excludes and destroys so much stuff by in terms of how we look at places and things and analyze them. But yeah, I mean, I think you gotta, it's not easy, and yeah, to proceed with caution.
Would any of our other discussants like to make a response to this question? And Martin, if you can, could you please turn your video back on for us? We miss your face.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with everything that Alexander just mentioned. But it might be a loaded term, but you need to be concerned only if you're prosecuting someone. But otherwise, every outcome of colonialism is genocide. So indigenous people have been claiming it, and we owe a duty of recognizing those epistemes and semantics as well when we talk about ongoing destruction. And also there's a big deal of politics of discomfort. I mean, merely fact that colonialism or genocide makes someone uncomfortable is not a good enough reason to back off from the actual material implications of these terms. And there's a big ongoing settler colonial project which warrants the increased use of the term. So even if it is not getting across to a large room of people, when we are talking to the wrong audience, or an audience that need to be recalibrated into why these terms are used. So I would highly recommend using more of genocide and ecocide. Eventually, hopefully in our lifetime, hope it makes it into actual legislations and we can talk about it in courts as well.
Markus and Martin, either of you have any reaction to that question?
I think
sorry, Markus. Yeah, thank you.
I think it does make sense to use it, like especially, for example, in the Amazon, where there's all the time tribes that are going extinct, like which used to have only a few members, and now there's none because of those expansions. In the book, I discuss some of those cases, like because it started quite recently, like in the 70s, those big road building projects and so on. So complete transformation of those rainforest areas into something that cannot be even like understood to be the old place, and the people removed from there and so on. And it's quite recent, you know, from the late 70s until today, and continuing. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for those responses. And I see in the chat, Danielle has said thank you very much for those answers also. I see Sam has a hand up. Sam, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
First of all, I'm so happy to see you, Sophia. I just listen to your podcast always. Now I see the face. I just want to thank you for the seminar. It was very useful. I just want to add some information to the mining area. My country is under a very, very restrict sanctions. So I'm from Iran, and we look like an island. There is no big companies, there is no big corporation, there is no Shell, no Nestle, but it doesn't mean that we do not have the problem, the mining problem, the extractivism here in Iran. The local corporation, the local companies do the same. I just haven't seen anything like this in the world, because, for example, somehow it is a national extractivism. And because of that, most of the effects are going back to ecocide. There is somehow there is no genocide. It seems that Iranian didn't kill doesn't kill Iranian. But the problem is that we cannot use the high technology in mining. So we have to use the second-handed machinery, and everything is in a low rendement. They are not efficient, they are not good working, especially in part of oil. So the sanctions are somehow good and bad. They are helpful and they are harmful. I just want to have your attention to the area of sanction, international sanctions, and the effect of the countries like Iran.
Thank you so much for your kind words and also that comment, Sam, very much appreciated. Would any of the discussants like to make a response to that intervention? All right. Well, thank you. I think that
thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
No, thanks for sharing. And I would look closer at what the state there has done with different nomadic groups and how they're approaching them as well. But overall, thanks for sharing. And it sounds, yeah, it's more difficult stuff.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Sam. And I now see Mirko has a hand raised.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for the presentation. I just have a question about the, thanks so much for unpacking, Alexander and others, about the complexities of, genealogy of genocide and, what comes when using it in this context. But I'm curious also, if you could expand, all of you, on the other side, when using ecocide, because, it's, emergent concept. There is a proposal that's been made by the Stop Ecocide Foundation. It's not yet part of international criminal justice system, and the proposal itself has been, of course, now is open to criticism and consideration. So I'm wondering, what comes when using a concept such as ecocide, for which we do not have a legal definition, especially in relation to what Alexander brought up in terms of you addressed it directly when corporations what is the intention, and because in the proposed definition of ecocide, one of the kind of key points and of contented points is that as it's being proposed now, it means that it is willful, or an act that is committed with knowledge that will cause harm. So yeah, if you'd like to expand on this point, thanks so much.
Alexander, or should I start first?
You start, please.
Okay. No, I haven't looked at any of the recent developments of ecocide, but earlier in 2016, ICC was supposed to take over on how I would like to engage with it. But there was some of the couple of drafts which came in very recently, and there's good amount of writing on opinion juris. I'm sure you have seen all of this. They will always, it's a point of any international legislation to bring in intentionality and willful and voluntary and the element of knowledge to decrease the degree of culpability that states would be responsible. So if the dominant voice of negotiation of the sovereign states, then they're doing everything in their ability to bring down how much they are going to be responsible. At best, they're going to pin the culpability on corporations, but there is also indirect chain of culpability, because corporations don't set them up and they don't start operating without the blessings of states in themselves. So I think there needs to be a stronger lobbying, as it happens with any other legislation, to bring different stakeholders to enact their own definition of ecocide, because I think we all need to have civil society, NGOs, and indigenous groups. In the same way we work towards UNDRIP, even if we got the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, even if we got the watered down provisions, it is still something that is aspirational and something we can build on. So our immediate goals when times of crisis is to bring out a draft which can be improved upon. And the people aren't ever getting the equal position to lobby at the first draft, but then having multiple drafts of these definitions, it doesn't have to be legal. I mean, law is not the province of lawyers alone or legislators, but to ensure there are multiple voices they can refer to and ensure to have a draft that you can then improvise on, then that is more important to me. So there's nothing we can do about intentionality at the moment. It's just like genocide. You need to have an intention to do it, but none of these structures have an intention. They just work in a very genocidal way. So it's a little beyond help, but can be improved, certainly.
I mean, I'll just try to say something really quick. So there's been a long history of trying to get ecocide in there from Vietnam era, but I think maybe kind of tagging onto what you're saying is that, how well has international law worked so far? And I mean, I think in the conference that went into a special issue that Damien Short and Martin Crook edited is, it came up in the conference, soon ecocide will just be kind of a new intervention scheme for geopolitics, and, really, how is it going to be used in practice? And obviously I'm a supporter of law in terms of ecocide being on there and being a part of it as a way to try to hold different kind of companies or governments accountable. But it's, I mean, I think there really has to be a way of more consciousness of people. I mean, even when there are decent laws, there's always the issue of enforceability of how to stop these things. So I think what's more important is to really just to have people empower themselves and to work the best they can to really stop these things where they're happening. And yeah, there's a lot in terms of, I see how communities are born and broken down and divided to make spaces to try to really enter areas to try to mine them or extract or build infrastructure. But there's a lot to be said, but I'll try to get to the.
Thank you, Markus and Martin. Do either of you have any response to that question? Okay, I'm hearing silence. So we have another hand up. Would Kay Parika like to answer their question? Or ask their question?
Hi, yeah, so I actually have a question for Markus, but other people can also say something, of course. So my background is in cultural anthropology, and I'm writing my thesis now on the mining industry in Finland. And so I ran into this term extractivism, and this whole political ecology thing is new to me. And it seems like the word is being used heavily in the context of like Latin America and, like Martin said, third world countries. But I'm actually intrigued by it, and I would really like to use it in my thesis. So how would you, do you have any thoughts on how you would go about this? Because I haven't really ran into it in the context of Finland or the Arctic or Scandinavia in general. And also, is that the right thing to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can use the concept of extractivism, you know, basically anywhere where you have these kind of dynamics. But of course, there you also need to understand that not all, for example, mining is similar, that it's good to have like detailed analysis of the different characteristics and degrees. So in this new book, for example, I suggest that you look at like different characteristics of extractivism. So for example, you look at if it erases most or all of the preceding life forms, or significantly reduces their number or spectrum in the extracted area. So you will have differences depending on the kind of mining you will have, and the kind of style, like for example, if it's open pit or underground and so on, and where it will be expanded. And then you should also study, you know, the role in terms of like creating power inequalities, different forms of violence, and so on. And so on. So it's also an issue about social justice and yields and so on. So basically this whole idea of like you are just pulling something out and without care for reciprocity or care. So that's kind of like extracting. That's the kind of attitude there and the practice. To which degree is it like that, in that way, hyper extractivist? And then once you have done that, if it's possible to move away from that stance or not, like, you know, and so on. In Finland, there's a big problem with very low royalties and foreign companies going in as well. So yeah, that's another aspect in the political economic sense that's problematic there in terms of the rents and so on. And then of course those other issues and problems. Yeah, so I would use the concept and framework of extractivism to study these issues, but also have a nuance there. And with that said, I wouldn't make all kind of comparisons, like, for example, saying that it's not so bad somewhere else than in some other place, because those places are unique. You cannot really compare them. You cannot have an ecological compensation or stuff like that. You know, for the locals, for especially for the people who are there, they are like unique places, and for the beings living in there, you cannot move them to another place. You cannot like buy a conservation area elsewhere. Yeah. So those are some kind of debates that have been going on in Finland, and I would be careful in studying those. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Fantastic. Would anybody else like to respond to using extractivism outside of the Latin American context?
I would say that we asked some other questions, but I think, of course, it's applicable. And Markus has certainly done well in the Arctic amongst other people. And Andrea just put something in the chat about how she used it in the UK. And yeah, I think it's widely applicable, but I think Markus's words are well taken in terms of looking at some of the specificities that go on in those areas.
Yes, absolutely. So we had a question come in earlier in the presentations. And so Armando wanted to know if any of you have thought about the notion of sacrifice zones and if sacrifice zone is applicable to this kind of discussion of the genocide and ecocide nexus, and if you use it in your research.
I'll just go since no one's saying anything, but yeah, sacrifice zones has been very much reoccurring in my research. I mean, and I think it's really, at least the place where I think of it coming from is from Russell Means in 1980s at a gathering where he actually called out a lot of leftist groups and really talking about how native territories are really treated as sacrifice zones. And yeah, sacrifice zones are very much related and is very much a term that I think dances around extractivism, ecocide, genocide, exterminations, existences. And yeah, it's easy, close. And you hear people talking about it all over the world, just like extractivism and ecocide.
Yeah. Hello?
Yes, please go ahead, Martin.
Yes, I would like to say that while it's sorry, it's a term that makes sense inside a discourse that that is looking for this, what they call this greater benefit, or what they call the greater good, but and taken for granted, if we get into that discourse and if we are going to play with it, which then we have to see what do these sites or what of those places have. And the thing is that many of the places that are labeled as such, as sacrifice zones, actually are very much important or have play a key role in the in climate, or like regulating climate, or the water supply, or yes, so the destruction of many of those zones actually creates a bigger damage in the picture, in the worldwide picture, because ecosystems are not isolated, but they are connected. So, for example, the case of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec being a straight, a narrow area, and having many big inland seas or lagoons, the world currents are affected by the winds that pass there. So the damaging of those sites is actually, well, having a big effect. So yeah, that's a thing to consider.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that reminder about how connected everything is. We have about 5 minutes left today. Did anybody want to say anything connected to the previous question, or should we go to one last question? Okay, moving on to one last question. This one also came in via the chat. This was from Angela, and she was wondering if there could be a further discussion on the question of intentionality when it comes to identifying and sustaining evidence for the ecocide genocide nexus. And she thinks that this is a key question in legal terms and political terms. If somebody would like to take that on.
Do you want to take the legal?
Oh yeah, it comes to me. No, I think we need to make them more flexible, especially now that we have a huge spate of climate litigation going on. So where the bigger question is causality. Did this corporation's actions cause the sustained emissions and consequently other extreme weather events? So we need to think about a lot of traditional doctrinal legal concepts, something like causation and intention. Both are loaded terms and devised especially to sustain lesser culpability on those drafting those very legislation. So this law being part of oppressive machinery is very true when it comes to start prosecuting things, especially that now we see it in climate litigation, not so much in litigation around ecocide, but Bolsonaro is being prosecuted. So let's see how that decision goes, because it just takes one court adopting a flexible, lucid language, bending the law or trying to change procedures which are treated as holy cows, but they're not. It just takes one good apex court making a good decision. So we'll wait for either a judicial initiative on the flexibility of terms, or we start a higher number of strategic litigation so that every decision that's been thrown out has incremental contribution to made for how these terms are going to be reinterpreted. And law keeps changing and legal interpretations keep changing. I mean, we haven't noticed it so far. It happens in all the legislation. So why not in terms of litigating ecocide and genocide? So that is my convoluted answer.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the biggest challenges besides the law itself, it's also the epistemology and approach that they take to these issues in general. And again, this goes back kind of the issue of materialism and the different type of epistemologies behind it. And the ways to kind of maybe get around this is the participatory mapping, you know, participatory environmental impact assessments that are very extremely interested in to hear how people feel and relate and who know their ecosystems better to kind of approach it, to even begin that place of understanding what will happen. Because at this point, you have areas that are full of different bio and human diversity, to use these horrible terms, that are regarded as unoccupied wastelands, ready for mine development infrastructure, or whatever it is. And so there's already such a high level of devaluing, and so everything's kind of already rigged in favor of these kind of extractive projects for industrial development and technology, new whatever, to kind of start peddling. So I think there really is a huge issue in even the science behind it. And so there has to be a kind of a re-leveling to be able to understand what is being lost. And so I think naturally there's a huge intent. There's a big intent to control land. There's a big intent to eradicate different species and existences. And there's environmental impact assessments and different consulting firms and different academics who are complicit and should be held accountable for their complicity in, and literally there's so many weird consulting firms where they're just pulling out these master's students or different professors to mark off these environmental impact assessments that are completely faulty and more or less paid for, or some combination of the two. And they're accomplices in this. They're accomplices in really facilitating the destruction of different ecosystems, and really maybe small scale ecocides in these areas, or at least large scale degradations, and really transforming space that's going to have such a huge impact. And it's going to take so many years for it to regenerate, and maybe we'll never be the same again. But yeah, I think there really is a deeper issue in terms of really our political structures, the legal structures, and the science that reinforce and more or less enable them to just grab everything.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Well, I mean, this is, I feel like we're just barely touching the tip of the iceberg, because this is such a big topic. And so there's so many different places that we could go, but unfortunately we are out of time here together today. But the fact that, you know, it feels like we could keep talking and talking is probably an indication that we should all get together again and have another event to further explore some of these huge, heavy topics that we've just barely started to touch on today. So I hope that everybody enjoyed this. Well, I mean, these are heavy topics, but I hope that this was a productive and interesting conversation for everyone. And I hope that you'll all join me in thanking our wonderful speakers and discussants. And yeah, and if you look in the chat, good recommendation for a source on intentionality. So yeah, thank you. That's the end of our time together.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. EXALT. Martin, it's great to see you. Sesh, yeah, everyone.